I am an author. While looking for inspiration for a book, I came across a series of stories surrounding a home in the American Pacific Northwest. It is an extremely ordinary-looking house in an extremely ordinary-looking residential neighborhood. But the stories that have emanated from its former residents and the people who lived in the town that it's located in are quite extraordinary. Through my research of the house on Wendell Lane, I have come across accounts that range from the supernatural to just plain bizarre. In order to protect the privacy of the people in the town, as well as the current inhabitants of the house on Wendell Lane, I have not only changed the name of everyone in these stories, but the name of the street as well. Wendell Lane is just an alias for the true location of these accounts. I visited the town that the house is located in during the summer of this year. I thought that meeting people face to face would be a good opportunity to learn more about the house on Wendell Lane, but I noticed quickly that my inquiries were met with a strange resistance from most of the townfolk that I questioned. Many were not interested in speaking to me. Others were standoffish when I brought up the house. I did get a few people to agree to sit down with me, but my interviews with them yielded little to nothing in regards to the information I was hoping to hear. I was all but ready to give up when I received a voicemail on my phone.
You have one new message. Main menu. To listen to your messages, press 1. Sorry. First, new message.
You're the writer that's been asking around about the house on Wendell Lane, right? Your number's been floating around town. Not a lot of people like to talk about the place, and well, some of us are discouraged. Speaking of that, I don't think you really should be hanging around much longer. All your interviews are starting to piss the wrong people off. Now, me personally, I ain't got a dog in the race. Sure, I've heard about the house, but well, there ain't much I can really tell you about it you probably don't already know. There's a guy who might be able to help you, though. His name's Bill Huckley. We got to talking when we heard you were in town, and he told me he wanted to meet with me. You can find him at AJ's tonight. The bar just off exit 31. He comes in every Friday and gets hammered. It'll be a better night, too. You won't know it. We ain't gonna meet in person. Some of the people who don't like you might also stop there. Be careful. One more thing. I suggest you don't hang around too much longer. They won't be able to cause trouble for you outside of town.
The message I received also informed me to ask Bill about Jim Baker, one of the more recent residents of the house on Wendell Lane. I assumed that there was some kind of a connection between the two of them. I arrived at AJ's that night around 10 p.m. The bar was a total dive, but I was surprised by how crowded it was. Part of me couldn't help but wonder if the mysterious caller was watching me as I scanned the room. I also wondered if anyone the caller had warned me about was there as well. I asked the bartender if she knew whether or not Bill Huckley was in the establishment that evening, and she pointed me towards a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a 5 o'clock shadow shooting pool in the back of the bar. It was Bill. I made my way over and introduced myself to him. To my surprise, he was willing to talk to me about the house and Jim Baker as well. We sat down, I turned my tape recorder on, and that's when his story began.
Yeah, I knew Jim Baker. Jimbo's what I called him. Played my fantasy football league last year. Good guy. But the dude was a total fish. Drafted a kicker in the 3rd round, easy money. Hadn't been doing too well this season, but I just picked up Buffalo's 2nd-string running back, and now I'm one blown ACL away from riding that horse to the playoffs, baby. You see, the key is to snag the guys who back up the guys with brittle bones and tendons that'll snap like Kit Kat bars. Then it's really just about playing the waiting game. What we were talking about again? Oh, yeah, Jimbo. He was a real mousy-looking cat, short and skinny. He had a beard, but he kept the thing so neatly trimmed that it looked like he painted it on his face before he left the house every morning. Wore thick glasses. One of the smartest guys you'll ever meet unless he was talking football. I think he was one of those, not hippie, but what do they call them now? Hipsters? Yeah, that's it. Anyway, I ain't saying he was a fairy, but Jimbo came in his bar every weekend, and not once did I ever see him with a woman. You'd think he'd be cleaning up, too, because he was pretty well off for a guy in his early 30s, drove a Benz, made a bunch of money in tech, then he decided to take a break from the fast life. Apparently he had a public freak-out a while back, said the stress had been building in him for years. Suppose that's why he moved out here and bought the house. Speaking of the house, I guess you've heard the stories, huh? Must take him pretty seriously if he came all the way from California to follow up on Jimbo. As for me, I never believed the rumors. Every town's got a stupid urban legend, and ours was no different. Still, every time something happened in that house, this community would work themselves into a frenzy, which meant I'd have to hear people ramble about the place for weeks. All the while, I'm the guy going, maybe the only reason old lady McNeely suddenly dropped dead in her living room was because old lady McNeely was 102 years old. Seriously. That old bag was so ancient, when she farted, sawdust came out her ass, and people wanted to call in an exorcist when she finally croaked. Now, have no fear, buddy. You ain't leaving here empty-handed. I know you flew up here for a story, and trust me when I tell you this, have I got a story for you. But before I tell it, I'm going to need a drink. I'll grab this round, you get the next. Hey, bartender, 4 shots of Jack. And, what'll you be having? All started around 6 months back. I was here at the bar when Jimbo walked in. He sat down right here at the table, and Trashy Tammy took his order. Guy looked like hell. Sweating bullets, and his face was whiter than the clan meeting at the North Pole. At this point, we'd grown to be pretty good acquaintances, you know, drinking buddies. So I could tell something was really bugging him when he didn't come up and say hi. He was just sitting there, staring off into space, not even touching his cheese fries. So I decided to mosey on over and see how he was doing. Sit down at the table, and before I even get to ask him what the deal is, it all comes pouring out of him. Tells me he saw a cockroach in his kitchen earlier that night. Says he can't stand the thought of being under the same roof with the thing. I ask him, why didn't he just kill it? And get this, he tells me he tried and just about burned his house down in the process. Yeah, good old Jimbo. Tried to roast the roach with one of those fancy blowtorches people use to brown the top of the creme brulee, but the sucker moved and his wallpaper caught instead. Now I'm laughing so hard at the guy that I nearly fall out of my chair. Can you imagine almost setting your kitchen on fire because you're too chicken to mush a bug? It's even funnier to me because I run a pest control company. Second biggest privately owned in the region, thank you very much, so killing bugs comes naturally to me. Once I catch my breath, I tell him I'd send one of my guys over to his place in the morning if he needed somebody to take care of it. That cheers him up right away. He hires me on the spot. I buy him a beer. He doesn't mention the cockroach again for the rest of the night. Next morning, I tell Miguel, my most trusted soldier, to spray Jimbo's house down. Once he finishes, Miguel shoots me a text to let me know that everything was copacetic. But that afternoon, I get a call from Jimbo. His voice is trembling on the phone. He says the cockroach isn't dead. I can hear the anxiousness in his voice, and he's asking me how long it takes before the poison starts working. Now, I'm not sure how much you understand about the delicate science of pest control, but my guys aren't messing around with the wimpy junk you get over the counter. We only use the very finest insecticides on the market, and any roach exposed to that stuff should belly up within a matter of minutes. So the fact that Jimbo was telling me we didn't get the job done left me more than a little perturbed. I asked him if he's sure the cockroach is still alive, and he tells me that he's looking at it on the wall in his bathroom, and that it's even bigger than before. At least 4 inches long, not including the antennas. That's a big effing roach. As a matter of fact, the only cockroach that's even known to grow that large is the Blabberus giganteus, otherwise known to a layman like yourself as the giant burrowing cockroach of Australia. And those are only native to, well, Australia. So I tell Jimbo that I'm coming down myself to scope the situation out. When I get there, the guy opens the door, and he's shaking like a meth head coming down from a 3-day bender. On top of that, he's nursing a pretty nasty lump on the back of his head. He tells me that after he got off the phone, he swatted the thing with a rolled-up magazine. Nailed it dead on. Didn't even budge an inch. Then he reared back to whack it again. The cockroach went on the offensive. It fluttered its wings and launched itself at him and buzzed around in his face. When he tried to scream, the nasty thing forced its way into his mouth, and Jimbo tells me it was so long its back end was sticking out of his lips like a cigar. He said it tasted like he was licking a dumpster. So in all the excitement, Jimbo stumbled backwards, tripping over the bathtub, and damn near knocked himself out when he banged his melon against the wall. Then the cockroach casually crawls out of his mouth and buzzes away. Now, Blabberus gigantus can't fly, so Jimbo's story ruled out that possibility. But I've never heard of any other type of roach growing even half that size, so I figured he must have been exaggerating. While I'm there, I check his pantry for droppings and egg cases, anything I can use to identify as unwelcome guests, but I can't find a thing. Most people would be relieved to hear that because it would mean that they most likely weren't dealing with an infestation, but most people aren't as high-strung as Jimbo was. He asked if we could tent the place. Normally, I'd strongly advise against fumigating a house for one solitary roach. Well, I paid thousands of dollars to accomplish the same job I can do with the sole of my boot. Kind of like dropping a live hand grenade down your pants to scratch your ass. But as I look into his eyes, I can see just how hot and bothered that bug has him. So I reluctantly agree and schedule him my next earliest appointment. 2 days later, tent goes up over the house. Hey, don't look at me like that. It's not like he couldn't afford it. He's just helping out a pal. So, what if I made a little money on the side? I'm a good guy, okay? I even let him sleep on my couch while we gas his house. Once the tent goes up, he shows up at my place with a duffel bag full of clothes and a smile on his face so big you would have thought he just hit the super lotto jackpot. My wife made meatloaf that night. Tasted like dog chow, but Jimbo gobbled it up like he hadn't eaten in days. After dinner, me and Jimbo go down to the den to have a beer. Ask him if he's seen the roach again since his run-in with it in the bathroom. He tells me things had been quiet as of late, but he caught a glimpse of it that morning before my guys showed up to fumigate his house. He was walking to the front door when it scuttled past him in the foyer. He said he almost jumped out of his skin when he saw it. According to Jimbo, the roach was about a foot long now and maybe 6 inches tall. Have you ever heard of a cockroach that big? Well, me neither, buddy, and I've pretty much seen it all in my line of work. In fact, I hadn't found any signs of a roach at his place at all, and neither had Miguel. So I get to thinking about how anxious Jimbo is all the time, and I remember he told me about the nervous breakdown he had that prompted him to retire early and move away from the city. So I start to wonder if the whole cockroach thing is just a figment of his imagination. The roach is all the guy can talk about while he's staying with me. He's obsessed. The next 2 days is cockroach this, cockroach that. My wife has the patience of a saint. She better if she's going to stay married to me. But even she was starting to get annoyed with his blabbering. I could tell she was relieved a couple days later when we took the tent down and told Jimbo it was safe to move back in. You know, I really hoped that would be the end of it. But that evening after dinner, I get a knock on my door, and when I open it, it's Jimbo. He's an absolute wreck. He's standing in my doorstep in his PJs with one house slipper on, and I can tell that he's been crying. I asked him what happened. He tells me that he was reading a book in bed when he heard a hissing sound. The noise was coming from directly over his head, so he looked up, and there on the ceiling was the roach, as big as a dog, he tells me. Said it was staring at him and fluttering its wings like it was about to strike again. Well, he rolled out of the bed, hit the ground so hard that he almost separated his shoulder, but he somehow managed to get up and sprint out of the bedroom unscathed. Apparently, he had even phoned the cops, but they reprimanded him for calling 911 just to complain about a cockroach, so that's why he had come to me. Now, at this point, I'm positive Jimbo's lost it, and I know my wife's going to kill me if I let him spend another night on the couch. So this is what I do. I invite him in, give him a beer, tell him to relax while I take care of it. Sometimes when a person is so caught up in their fantasy that they can't tell the difference between what's real and what isn't, the only thing you can do is an indulgence. I ask him for his spare key, and I head out to his place. When I get there, I let myself in the front door. I look around Jimbo's house, and just as I expected, the place is empty, even the bedroom. So this is what I do. I send a text to Jimbo, and it reads something like this. Whoa, you were right. That's the biggest sucker I've ever seen. Got it, though. Nailed it point blank in its nasty face with enough insecticide to kill a horse. Euthanized the disgusting thing just in time because it looked like it was ready to lay eggs. Going to dispose of the body properly before the larva hatches. Be back in 15 minutes. Then I leave my hat on his kitchen counter just so he can be sure that I was there. Now, I thought I was pretty crafty, but Jimbo didn't buy my ruse. No matter what I said, he would not go back inside the house. Couldn't help but feel guilty when I told him he couldn't spend the night at my place, but he seemed to understand. I heard he crashed at Richie Hooper's for about a week before Richie's wife kicked him out. Then he spent a couple days at Pete Dunn's. After he'd exhausted all his friends, he started shacking up at the Budget Motel just off the interstate. Didn't see him around after that. Stopped coming into the bar. Then all of a sudden, cops show up and start asking questions. Turns out he went missing. Melanie Swan was the last to see him. She lived across the street. Said she watched him head inside his house with a brand new hunting rifle. Walked in, Never walked out. Weird, huh? Well, it gets weirder. Remember how I left my hat over at his place? Well, I'd forgotten all about it, and when I finally remembered where it was, Jimbo was already long gone. But I still have the spare key he gave me, so I drive over there after work one day and let myself in the front door. Now, the house is a mess. Chairs are knocked over, the glass coffee table in his living room is broken, the place stinks to hell and back, and I'm thinking it's pretty obvious that Jimbo must have gone off the deep end. I'm feeling really, really sorry for the guy, but then I start to hear a noise coming from the kitchen. Sounds like someone, but there's a shuffling sound. I'm thinking maybe Jimbo came back. I call out his name, but all I hear is more shuffling. Then some kind of crunching sound like someone's biting into an apple. I wonder if there's a burglar in there. I'm against the wall right next to the kitchen door now, and I can hear that there's definitely someone in there. So as quietly as I can, I peer around the corner, and that's when I see it. Jimbo's cockroach, just as real as you and I. It's enormous. If I had to guess, I'd say close to 7 feet long. Standing next to you, it would come up to about your hip. Its antennas are as long as my legs. Thing's eyes are like 2 black softballs, and its mandibles look like industrial-sized pruning shears. Right away, I recognize the stench in the house is coming from it. It doesn't smell like an ordinary roach infestation. I would have been able to pick that up immediately. No, this was way more pungent. There's really no describing. It took 2 days to get the stink out of my nostrils, and it still comes back to me from time to time like an acid flashback. The thing is eating something. For a second, I think it's a loaf of bread from Jimbo's pantry, but as it spins in its mouth, I see a face. Jimbo's face. I hear another sickening crunch and realize that noise is the sound of my old pal's skull cracking inside the giant cockroach's maw. I try to back away slowly, but the thing spots me and flutters its wings. The sound is horrific, like 1,000 angry bees getting ready to swarm me. Each beat of its wing hits me with a wave after wave of the noxious stink it produces. I'm pretty sure it wants to attack, but lucky for me, it's too big to take off in Jimbo's tiny kitchen, so it settles down and goes back to chewing on the poor guy's head. I take that as my cue to hightail it out of there. I book it out the door, hop in my car, then put the pedal to the metal. When I get far enough away, I make an anonymous call to the cops and tell them I saw armed gunmen break into Jimbo's house. What was I supposed to say? That there was a giant cockroach eating my missing friend's head? By the time the police arrived, the roach was gone. Never did find Jimbo's body, but I don't think anybody ever will. I believe the stories about that house now, all of them. I keep wondering if I'm going to get a call one day from the next people who buy that place. If I do, I'll tell them to give Orkin a ring, because I'll never set foot in there again. There's something wicked in that house. It's your turn to buy the round, and don't be cheap. Make mine a double this time.
Although there's no internet access or even cell phone service in this tiny cabin where I sit typing, perched on a cliff high above the Pacific Ocean. Still, I write this blog, in the hopes that it might find some new civilization, long after mankind is gone. If this may be a testament to one man who found faith in religion after doubting for so long. See, I was never a spiritual or superstitious man. I was a man of science, a student, a marine biologist before this. I never had what one would call faith in anything resembling religion. To me, it was all math, everything. The strange mutation of life was simply an exponential progression of evolution. But now, as I see the sacramental fires burning bright on the beach below me, and feel the awakening of the ancient echo in my sleep and dreams, now that I realize that man's time is over, and it is a new beginning of beings much greater and more powerful than our own, I offer up a poem, a sacrament, a narrative to the events that unfold before the Great Awakening. Let me start at the beginning. I was a doctoral student at the University of California, Santa Cruz, working on my PhD in marine biology. Mollusks were my specialty, specifically, as they are known by their common name, red abalone. Abalone are an edible type of sea snail, a marine mollusk. Single-shell gastropod found in coastal waters around the globe. Like all snails, they have a head with a mouth and a pair of eyes, and a foot, which they use to cling to rock formations while using their file-like tongue to scrape algae matter into their mouths. They also have an enlarged pair of tentacles. They are considered a delicacy, their flesh being comparable to calamari. Red abalone, the largest and most prized of the species, are found only on the west coast of North America. Red abalone are not endangered, but because of overfishing and acidification of oceans, they have become rather scarce. That's why California put a ban on commercial fishing of them in the 1990s. They can be harvested for personal use only north of San Francisco, April to November, with a hiatus in July, and with a limit of only 3 a day and a total of 18 a year. Since I was writing my doctoral thesis on Haliotis rufescens, it was deemed that I should spend the summer in a tiny fishing village called Shelter Cove. There I would study, measure, count, and map the abalone, and also report any suspicious activities relating to abalone poachers to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So when the school semester ended in June, I packed up all my gear, scuba set, books, slides, specimen jars, microscopes, and strapped my kayak to the roof of my trusty old Subaru Outback and headed north up Highway 101 for Shelter Cove. Shelter Cove is a quiet little hamlet on the coast of Humboldt County. The sign as you enter declares it an island in time. There's only one long, winding road in, which climbs up to nearly 2,000 feet as it transcends the summit of King Range Mountain. And conversely, only that one twisting, dangerous, cliff-strewn road out. To the south is nothing but inaccessible shoreline facing steep cliffs, dotted with pockets of tiny beaches where the surf smashes down on jagged rocks, and deep, dangerous tide pools. To the north, it's relatively the same, only a thin, potholed dirt road winding over the cliff slightly to the east. This is why this area is known as Humboldt's Lost Coast. The brave surf and kayak here, but it's a notorious riptide. And once, an entire troop of tired Boy Scouts resting on the beach were swooped up by a sleeping wave and sucked out to their deaths in the ocean's depths. The lodgings that were given to me consisted of small cabins, nothing more than a shack, really, perched high up on a cliff. To the right, I could see the boat launch the fishermen used, the caged-in area where they gutted their catch. A small stretch of beach lay there, where locals would drive their pickup trucks up onto the sandy shore and drink beer and barbecue. To my left was another stretch of beach they called Dead Man, separated from the boat landing by a jutting cliff. Dead Man, a favorite surf spot, is only accessible by the ocean. The surfers have to paddle on their boards around the cliff face to get there. The only internet access on Shelter's Cove is from satellite, and the university was too cheap to put one up on the shack that they had supplied me with. I couldn't even get cell phone service to use my phone as a hotspot. So when I had to post my data on the university science lab website, I would have to travel down the road a few miles to a coffee shop in the lobby of an old hotel that had Wi-Fi. There I could also manage to get cell phone service, but only in the parking lot at the top of a steep embankment. A young single mom and her 9-year-old girl Susie. On my first day, as I was unfastening my ocean kayak from the roof of my battered old Subaru Outback, Susie rode right up to me on her pink huffy bike, an inquisitive look on her round little face. "Who are you?" she asked in that bluntly curious manner children from small towns often have. "My name's Theodore." She nodded as if she approved of my name, her eyes wandering along all of my equipment. "What's all this stuff?" "This is my scuba gear. Now, there are specimen jars, and these, here in these boxes, are microscopes. With a microscope, you can see real small stuff. I know what a microscope is. The sixth graders use them at my school. Why do you have all this stuff?" "Oh, I'm a scientist. I'm here to study abalone." "Abalone? Gross. My Uncle Bob tries to get me to eat that stuff every 4th of July. I don't like seafood." "You live in a fishing village? You don't like seafood?" "No. I don't like anything slimy, stinky, slippery, wet, or gross." She nodded her little head in that authoritative manner she had used when I told her my name, and then rode off, leaving me standing there laughing. After that day, whenever Susie rode past on her bike and saw me, she would stop and talk, though she claimed to hate slimy stuff. "Oh," she squealed, "get away!" And I held up my baby squid for her inspection. She soon fell prey to the wonders of nature, marveling over a sea urchin, or laughing uproariously at the awkward antics of a huge, Dungeness crab that I had brought back from the ocean for her amusement. Her big brown eyes would gleam, and her pigtails would bob up and down as she stroked a starfish. I showed her the tiny holes in the mantle of the abalone's thick domed shell, the repository apertures, and explained to her how the sea snail vented water through them with its gills. She stared into the microscope at macroalgae, and I explained how the abalone fed on them, with a small, medium piece of the radula. As her enthusiasm began to grow, I sensed a future marine biologist in the making, and grew to truly love her visit. I quickly settled into a routine of waking early and taking my kayak out to dive. Even though it was summer, the water was cold, averaging about 50 degrees, and I had to wear a full wetsuit with a hood and gloves. I would pull my hood over my head, pull down my half mask, put my regulator's mouthpiece into my lips, then slip into the murky waters to explore the underwater rock formations with my flashlight, looking for the domed brick-red shells that are underwater home of the abalone. They suction themselves to the craggy surfaces. I would count and measure them, and then return to my kayak to scrawl out my findings. It was peaceful work, but it could be dangerous. Every year, dozens of abalone divers wash up dead on the shores, smashed against the rocks by the swell or sucked into dark ocean caves. In 2004, an abalone diver who ironically worked for the Recreational Fishing Alliance and was on a federal fishers management panel was attacked by a great white shark while diving not too far south from here, off the coast of Mendocino. When his friends first saw the huge cloud of blood in the water, they thought it was some kind of sick joke. They were gravely mistaken. His mauled and ravaged body washed up on shore a day later. In the evenings, I would type out my statistics on my laptop, their average depth and proximity to the shore, and in my free time, I would wander the desolate shoreline exploring the tide pools while I sipped a local microbrew and sampled some of the fine cannabis the hills to the east were famous for. I'd gaze up at the sky, streaked in pink and purple as the sun sank down into the ocean, watching pelicans beat their wings in unison, the high-pitched wails of young harbor seals echoed off the towering bluffs. I was happy. As happy as I'd ever been. By mid-third week, I had charted the entire shoreline for over half a mile. At the end of the first month, I had made enough inroads with the notoriously secretive locals to be invited to a party. It was a wild event held on a sprawling manor that sat on the grassy hillside with the ocean spread out below it. It was the last day of June. It would be a month-long hiatus for abalone harvesting all of July, so the abalone divers would be throwing a feast. It was abalone wontons, abalone salsa, two kinds of abalone sausage, but the most scrumptious was the abalone wrapped in dates, goat cheese, and bacon and beef fried. All of this, as well as the standard fare of salmon, halibut, cod, and oyster. Bottles of wine from nearby vineyards littered the table, and ruddy-faced fishermen gathered around kegs of local microbrew. The sheriff was there in full uniform, and when someone passed him a joint, he puffed it and passed it on like everyone else. A week into July, I noticed a massive amount of abalone missing off the point of Dead Man. Abalone concentrate where the current flow causes drift seaweed to accumulate. Because abalone expend a large amount of energy when moving, they tend to stay in one location. Last week, the point of Dead Man had been littered with abalone. Now, there wasn't a single one left. I shone my flashlight along the submerged rock. Nothing. I reached my hand into a narrow crevice, built around the deep fissure for the telltale feel of those thick shells. Cautious and aware that a swell could suck me into the narrow space, crush my bones, wedge me in, and trap me. Even if there wasn't a moratorium on abalone fishing, going on an absence of this size was unprecedented. This had to have been some kind of large-scale poaching. In San Francisco and Chinatown, dried abalone sells as an aphrodisiac for $2,000 a pound. A haul this big could easily net over $500,000. First, I alerted the Fish and Game Department. Next, figuring that the poachers, after having exhausted the supply on that point, would move down to the Dead Man's Cove itself, and that they would most likely come in the early twilight hours. I decided to stake out Dead Man's Beach to see if I could catch the poachers if they returned. The only way accessible to Dead Man's Cove is over the ocean. So I hauled my kayak out of the boat launch, slipped it into the dark water, waves lapping at the concrete pier, jumped in, and paddled out. There was a full moon, but the fog was rolling in thick across the relatively calm water. I kayaked past the beach where a few pickup trucks were still parked, surfers relaxing on the shore and having a few beers after a day of riding the waves, and made my way around the towering point on Dead Man, carefully avoiding the crescent of jagged rocks that rose out of the black water and fog. Paddling into the small cave, I rode the surf up onto the beach. Towing my kayak across the black pebbly sand of the cliff face, I found a small cave, nothing more than a craggy wrinkle in the bluff, and tucked my kayak into it, camouflaging it with driftwood, dried seaweed, and a few handfuls of sand. With my kayak hidden, I hiked down the beach, and behind a large washed-up tree stump, I set up my small, one-person tent. I hunkered down for the night, staying awake for a good while, but then drifting off to a light slumber, determined to sleep lightly, and awaken as early as I could. In the middle of the night, I awoke to a garbled noise. I at first assumed it was a yapping of sea lions, but as sleep left me, I realized it was human voices. They sounded like they were singing or chanting. I poked my head out of my tent. The entire beach was now draped in a thick shroud of fog, but when I peered out into the darkness, I was startled to see a mass of orange flames flicking up into the night sky. There was a large bonfire, and silhouetted around appeared to be a circle of people. Was I dreaming? I blinked my eye and focused on the fire, and yes, around the fire was a ring of people in black hooded cloaks. They held hands and slowly circled around the flames, chanting with the fog swirling around them. On the outside of the circle were others, also in dark cloaks, remaining still as statues, holding torches. They couldn't see me, hidden in the fog behind the massive log, and I watched curiously. It was definitely strange, but I just assumed it was a bunch of teenagers getting weird, or maybe even a coven of old hippie Wiccans getting their witch on. That wouldn't be unheard of in these parts. I watched the strange ritual for over an hour till they were done. Then they responsibly put out their fire, which impressed me, buried its smoldering remains in sand, and wandered up into the ravine where a trail took them up the cliffside. There was a way to Dead Man's Cove besides the ocean. I would have to scope out that trail when I got a chance. Maybe the abalone thief used it to get to the beach. Since the strange cultists, or whatever they were, had not waded out into the ocean or given any sign of abalone poaching, I paid them no real mind. Live and let live, right? Just a bunch of kooks getting weird. I had often heard that Humboldt County was a weird place, and that southern Humboldt was even weirder. I waited all day on the beach for any signs of poachers eating trail mix and dried fruit, but saw nothing. When the sun set and the sky began to grow dark, I packed up my tent and went and retrieved my kayak. I had been on the beach for over 24 hours and had seen no sign of the abalone thief. I pushed my kayak out into the surf, jumped in, and paddled back around the point. That night, even though I was exhausted from my little expedition, I was restless and unable to sleep, tossing, turning in my bed. I went outside onto the cliff's edge to smoke a joint and drink a beer to calm my nerves. The slight breeze stirred the leaves of the manzantia that lined the cliff edge, the salty smell of the sea, heavy in the air. It was then that I noticed from up here I could just make out a fire burning on Dead Man's below me. Tiny silhouettes of circling acolytes around it. I could even make up the torchbearers that encircled the group. They were back, the local weirdos. Probably just a bunch of goth and metal kids who listened to too much Marilyn Manson. The beer and pot were doing their trick, and I yawned, feeling exhaustion take over. That night, I had the first of the dream. I dreamt I was in the ocean, deep underwater beneath the waves. Examining abalone, I ran my fingers over their hard outer shells, imagining their Fimbrian head lobes, their colomellar muscles. It was breeding time, and I could see their respiratory apertures venting eggs and sperm into the ocean's water column. I had no scuba gear. I didn't need it. It felt as if I had some sort of gills, for I could feel the salty water swooshing in and out of me as it churned, cold and green. Full of fascination, I studied the formations of rock and shell as a hand, almost human, crept over the craggy shelf. It was covered in pale green scales, and the tips of the fingers ended in black claws. It reached out and took hold of the abalone red shell and slowly peeled it off the rock, the slime trail the sea snail used to locomote itself, leaving a viscous ooze stain. I gazed in wonder as a humanoid head then rose up over the rock ledge, a face with the features of a fish, gills, small holes where the nose should have been, massive black, empty eyes. I stared on as the creature put the abalone to its mouth, and with fanged teeth pulled the sea snail slowly out of its shell and began chomping on it, swallowing it in quick, eager gulps. It was done. They extended a long, thin, black tongue, forked like the tongue of a snake, and licked the empty shell clean. So this is the abalone thief, I thought to myself, with the calm and calculating mind of a scientist, without any fear whatsoever. Then I saw, out of the murky distance to the ocean floor, more. There were more of them, hundreds of them, maybe even thousands of them, an army of these scaled sea creatures feeding on the abalone. I realized they were gaining sustenance to strengthen themselves. They were preparing for something. This army of creatures was readying themselves for the coming of a being greater than that had ever roamed the earth. They awaited a great awakening, and in a massive epiphany, I realized the importance of their mission, and that I was needed. I must join them, lend my psychic support. And then I realized that the cult on the beach was doing just that. What their goal was. Then I looked down at my hands and realized that my hands, too, were webbed, covered in scales. I was one of them. I awoke, bathed in sweat, shivering, unable to dislodge the strange dream from my mind. The dream was bizarre, silly. Obviously, it had no bearing on reality. Sea creatures poaching the abalone, but something within me felt different. I felt very unscientific. For the first time in my life, I felt an inexplicable spirituality, a desire to worship a higher being, a higher power. I felt very, very scared, though I couldn't say why. The next day, I searched for the path that led to Dead Men. I realized that from my cabin I could walk along the cliff edge, between the clumps of coyote bush and dune tansy, down the hill into a gully that eventually formed into a steep, rocky ravine. Following this ravine down into a small valley, I found the trail. Nothing more than a deer or elk path, really. On an impulse, I decided to stake it out that night, to watch and see if that strange group appeared again, just to check them out, for curiosity's sake, and see what they were up to. If I could identify any of them, maybe I could question them about the abalone thief. See if they had any good intel of boats, strangers coming or going from the beach. And that night, sure enough, as I crept down the ravine, I could see the fire burning on the beach below. I positioned myself off the trail and above the cove, just close enough to see the beach fairly well with my binoculars. I crouched down and put the binoculars to my eyes. I could see that they were holding hands around the fire again, slowly rotating, more likely chanting the strange mumbo-jumbo that I had heard last night. I tried to make out their faces to see if I could see anyone, but their hoods obscured them, and all I could see were dark shadows where their faces should be. I scanned the gathering with my binoculars and noticed something going on off to the side. Some sort of commotion against the cliff wall. Two hooded figures were holding a struggling figure by its arm. I focused my binoculars, and what I saw made my mouth go dry and my gut clench. It was Susie. They were holding little Susie, and she was naked and struggling with me. Then, as I watched helplessly above, they pulled her forward to the fire. It took 4 of those cloaked maniacs to hold the squirming girl down as another, this one's robe, the crimson red, raised what must have been a knife above her, for it glinted in the moonlight, long and pointed. I froze. What should I do? What could I do? There had to be at least a dozen of them down there. Then it all happened so quickly. The knife fell, and I thought I could hear that little voice I knew so well cry out in pain and go silent. The crimson-robed one hacked into her chest and pulled out a dark object I can only assume was her heart and brought it to his mouth. He then passed it on. Little Susie's pale, naked body now limp and crumpled on the sand. I had to do something. I had to call the cops. I spun around and clawed myself up off the ravine, and as I did so, my foot slipped, and I sent a shower of pebbles and dirt down into the mist-covered gully. I froze, my mouth dust dry, clinging to the rock face. As I noticed, with a pounding heart, I started back up. Once I got to the top, I sprinted over the bluff to my Subaru. Now out of breath and huffing, fumbling with the keys, I started the engine and sped down the road. I squealed into the parking lot of the inn in the Lost Coast. I leapt out of my car with sweaty, shaking hands, dialing 911 on my iPhone. When I told the operator what had happened and where I was, she transferred me to the sheriff. "Calm down," he said, and explained to me again what happened. "I saw them kill her," I said. "Kill her and eat her heart." "Who?" "Susie Anderson." "Susie Anderson. Susie Anderson that lives on the corner of Toss and Steelhead with her mother, Kathy?" "Yes, I'm sure it was her. On the beach at Dead Man." "You say she's been murdered?" "Yes." "By a cult in hoods. On the beach?" "Yes! Fuck! They ate her goddamn heart! Are you listening to me?" "Okay, Ted. Okay. Just calm down. Now listen. What I want you to do is go on home. I'll check up on this and stop by after I get it all sorted out." "But they killed her!" Now, Ted. But no more buts, Ted. You go on home, and I'll see you there. Got it? I couldn't believe how nonchalant the sheriff was being. But what could I do? I just have to do what he said. Go back to my cabin and wait for him. Okay, I said. As the lines were silent. I stared down at the black device in my hand, knowing if I left this one small spot of land, it would be rendered useless. I'd be cut off from the rest of the world alone. But what could I do? He was the sheriff. Even if he was an overweight pothead, he was the sheriff, and I had no choice but to listen to him. I drove back to my cabin and I waited. I looked out over the cliff face, but I couldn't see the fire burning anymore. I drank a beer. I tried to go over my data, but I was too shaken up. My hands shook so bad I couldn't even manage to type numbers into the keyboard of my laptop. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It startled the living shit out of me. It shook me to the very bone. Wishing I had just hightailed it out of there earlier, driven away down that long, winding road. It was the only way in or out, never to come back. I crept up to that door and cautiously pulled the curtain of the window back. Peeking out the window, I saw the sheriff standing at my doorstep with Susie's mother, Kathy, and the little girl. I tentatively pulled the door open. "This is the girl you saw murdered?" The sheriff immediately barked at me. I gazed at the little girl before me. The girl the same age and height as Susie, with similar hair, but definitely not Susie. "No, this isn't her." I said, "Susie Anderson." The little girl looked up at Susie's mother. "What's he talking about, Mama?" "This is Susie Anderson," the sheriff grumbled. "And this is her mother. Known both of them my whole goddamn life. Now what the hell is going on around here?" No, it's not. This is not Susie. I saw them kill her," I shouted. Someone had to fucking believe me. I gazed up to Susie's mother, who looked at me like I was crazy and clutching her little girl to her. "Mama, Ted is scaring me." "Okay, you two go wait in the car," the sheriff mumbled, waving Susie's mother and the little girl along. He then put one of his big, beefy hands on my shoulder and pushed me into the cabin. "Listen, mister, you're scaring the little girl half to death, and you need to tell me what the fuck is going on." He spoke into my ear, and his breath was hot on my face. "You on drugs? Doing a little meth and staying up all night and doing your research?" He gazed suspiciously around the room. The specimen jars full of bugs and mollusks. The beakers of seawater samples and glass slides. "So I gotta go get a warrant for my old buddy Judge Johnson and come back here to search this place? Am I on drugs?" I shouted. "Me! I just saw you smoking a joint at that party." He laughed a hearty laugh and grinned a big shit-eating smile. "Hell, son, that's my glaucoma. I've had medical marijuana for over 15 years. Was one of the first people in the Cove to get it. Everyone knows that." I was starting to feel dizzy. The room was beginning to slowly rotate. "All right, son. You don't look so good." "Fire on the beach. Did you check the fire?" "Yeah, I went down there. Looks like a bunch of kids are having a party. Left fucking beer cans everywhere, but they're gone now." "You went down? How? How do you think I walked?" "You know about that secret trail?" "Secret trail? Damn, you're a dumb one, ain't you? That fucking trail ain't secret. Everyone knows how that fucking trail works." I staggered back. The sheriff pulled out a chair and pushed me heavily onto it. "I saw it. I saw them kill her and eat her heart." "You didn't see nothing." Sometimes the light of the moon reflects off the water, the sound and the rhythm of the ocean. They can play tricks on your mind. Trust me, I've seen many good men go a little crazy out here. Shelter Cove is known to have its share of crazy. They don't all start off that way. I set my face to my hands and shook my head. But I... He put his big mitt of a hand on my back. In a tender way, gave me a pat. "Tell you what, son, you get some rest. Sleep on it. I'll come back tomorrow afternoon and we'll talk again. Even take a little walk down to the beach. I'd like a walk with a scientist guy like you. Maybe you could tell me what some of that weird-looking shit in the tide pool is." I fell asleep that night. I don't know. It was as if I'd been drugged. I drank half a beer and a great lethargy fell over me, and I stumbled to my bed because my eyes heavy and was asleep before my head hit the pillow. That night, the final dream came to me. I had the great realization. I was in the ocean with all the other people, the cool, salty water swooshing in and out of our gills, the light of the moon sending out great shafts of pale light through the deep, murky water. Of course, we were harvesting abalone, eating some for our own strength, bringing back armfuls of others for the great one who slept out in the ocean's depths, the Dark Lord, who was awakening and would soon rise in a fury of black, leathery wings and tentacles the next day, and who would soon rise in a fury of black, leathery wings and tentacles The next day the sheriff arrived at my house, as he said that he would. He brought with him a box. I opened it to find a large, black, hooded cloak. I slipped the cloak over my head, pulled up the hood, and together we walked down to the beach to start the fire and await the arrival of the others. I can see my house from here, atop the small cliff at the edge of the woods. I suppose you could see it too. But it's my time now. My time to look upon the things taken from me. My time to take root in what has become my evil. My father and I came here from Sussex in spring of 1742. We were poor, barely getting by, and not far from a life of poverty in the streets. Truth be told, we fared no better than that. Father was out of work, and we lived in a small hut that barely kept out the wind and snow. We went days at a time without food, and sickness came easily. Mother, she didn't make it. Father and I barely scraped by that winter, and with nothing to show for it but a long, painless bout of mourning. I was only 5 at the time, helpless. Father swore that he would never lose me the way that he lost Mother. Needless to say, it was a tough decision. But he supposed we'd find a better life in the colonies, even if the only way to see us across the Atlantic was in a red coat with a musket in hand. So after a number of months at sea, we found ourselves in a small fort south of Boston. My father served His Majesty in the New World. We were sent here directly with little to no welcome or introduction. They said Father would find everything that he needed here on arrival, from training and briefing to housing accommodations. They said they needed all the help that they could get. No time for formalities. Their sense of urgency made Father nervous. We never really had a chance to protest or reconsider, especially since we had already come so far. We were escorted to our new home within a week. Fort Wayland, they called it. A fringe installment with no real strategic value. Apparently, the place served another purpose. At first, some spoke of it with sarcasm and dissent, annoyed to have been stationed there for such a ludicrous reason. They regarded it as nothing more than their commanding officer's paranoid response to an old ghost story, though some say they saw it with their own eyes. In any case, that fort was not meant to guard against any man. It was meant to keep something more sinister, I think. We had hardly settled in before we started seeing something, too, whatever it was. They sounded like children about the same size I was, except they made no sound but for the rustling of leaves under their feet, or at least what I assumed was feet. I never really saw them clearly either, just fleeting glances before they scurried back into the brush the treetops were, from wherever they came. They weren't human, that much was certain. They terrified every man within those fort walls, armed or otherwise, especially when they learned that their weapon fire was useless. Every shot missed its mark. After all, no one can hit, but one can hardly see. When we arrived, hunting parties still regularly ventured deep into the woods in an attempt to rid us of whatever haunted them. And a few men even deserted. Rather, that's what we had hoped. They were never seen or heard from again, and nobody liked to entertain the idea of the alternative. Yet, for all of the constant fear and worry, there was only a single obvious victim, only one person for whom we could reasonably assume an unpleasant end. In spite of all of his amassed forces and paranoia, it was the captain they questioned. The men said they found his quarters empty one day, ransacked, and the floor covered in fallen leaves and twigs. Just as the other unfortunate, he had vanished by a train. Strangely, everything fell quiet after that. No more sounds of children pattering around the woods. No more sightings, no more terror. It seems they had claimed what they were after. They had no interest in the rest of us. For long, the whole ordeal faded to an unpleasant memory. sense of normality. Father had already watched over those woods for the better part of 12 years. His service earned us enough money for a new life in this land, and we took the opportunity as soon as it presented itself. Father resigned from military service, choosing a civilian life to raise me and open a general store. When the military pulled out and stationed elsewhere, the fort itself served nicely for the foundations of a trading post, and that is where we stayed for the remainder of my childhood. When we finally scraped together enough money, Father left to open a store in South Boston. It was a dream that he had spoken of from the moment we arrived on those shores. I had helped run his business over the years, so he invited me to move with him, to settle down and start a family business. Still, he left the decision up to me. I was 17, and he considered me a man. And looking back now, I wish I had. Instead, I chose to stay behind and strike my own path through life. I had made friends with some other boys during my time there, hunting rabbits in the woods after the danger had passed. It was something I loved, and several of us decided to make a living hunting and trapping, selling our wares to the trading post in my father's old store. For the following 5 years, life had been good to me. The forest had blessed me with an abundant bounty and a respectable living, as well as the attention of a young girl I might have married one day. I had built a happy life for myself, and I thought that I had come to know every corner of these woods. Then, there was them. And they showed me a place I never knew existed, a place with which I've since become all too familiar. They arrived slowly at first, a few rustling sounds on hunts that I took for foxes or squirrels in the underbrush. Then the sounds grew in number, more frequent, more hectic. And they followed. They were no animals I knew, these things that so boldly approached without fear of man. On one of my longer outings, they haunted my camp. I began to see them in the shadows just beyond the firelight, clearer than I ever had before. Mischievous little imps, bodies like knots of wood and vines, tufts of grass and flowering plants atop bobbling lumps with a visage semblance of head. They danced like elated children in and out of sight, and made sounds that I'd never heard before. Scratchy, wet clicking noises, like ghostly giggles from broken pillows. This behavior was new. Where they had once hidden from me, they now clearly sought my attention. In fact, they seemed to beckon. Truly, I sensed no hostility from them, and from the depths of the woods came something else, new, a sweet scent hanging on the breeze, warm and welcoming, in the same manner as freshly baked bread. Perhaps more so. I'd not have thought to call it merely pleasant. No, it was more compelling. That scent, witching aroma came from them. It was a portent of their coming. It grew stronger with their every visit. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled, terribly powerful, and it stirred something in me. I know now that they used it to lure me, and I'm sad to say that it was a great effect. Totally unaware of myself, I began to track my quarry on a very specific path, a narrow and invisible road marked by that damnable odor. But it would fade off. I would sink into melancholy fatigue, dissatisfied with the typically brisk and invigorating air of the wild. I would make camp when it left me, sometimes early to eat my growing weariness, and there I would remain until the scent returned. It always did. Those woods nearly chewed me to the bone before I found my way through, and the imps of leaf and root led me faithfully to my fate. I crawled my way through a gauntlet of dense thorn bushes from dawn till dusk, and they left my clothing in tatters that barely clung to the thorns. I was an utter mess, caked from head to toe in the drying filth of the untamed acres. I had no provisions left and little energy left for travel. One can imagine my relief when I finally emerged into a clearing. And in that clearing, awaited a small, crude, precariously constructed cabin. I was astonished, to say the least. It was deeper in the woods than I had ever bothered to explore, deeper than my trade would ever take me, and much too far from my sign of civilization to be worth the trip. For whatever reason, the latter half of my journey proved little to no gain to sustain me, let alone to make a living. Worse yet, I could find no source of clean water within reasonable distance. Who would build a home here? And how could they possibly hope to survive? Of course, I was not in the proper state of mind to give these questions the consideration they warranted. Near death and with no way to survive the trek home, even if the imps would grant me control of my senses to do so, I could only rejoice at the chance of rescue. So I approached the cabin, hoping beyond hope for a hot meal, a cool drink, and a warm bed. It was only in the first few steps of the clearing that I escaped the bewitching scent trail. For the first time in what must have been months, I left home in the middle of the summer that year, and I arrived at the cabin to find leaves crunching beneath my boots. And with that sound came another realization. It was the only sound I could hear. In fact, it was the only sound I had heard in quite some time. For days preceding, as far as I could tell, I had been the only source of movement or life in those woods. I hadn't heard so much as a single bird chirping in the canopy. I had been too entranced by the scent to notice that no life resided there, other than the trees, myself, and whoever occupied the mysterious cabin that stood before me. The thought unnerved me, though not enough to sway me from seizing the chance. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door. Each step to the crunching forest floor betrayed my presence, rendering any attempt itself effectively useless. Something about the place seemed so ominous, so damning. Part of me felt the urge to flee. But another part felt welcome. Little did I know just how welcome I really was. But I was soon learning. As loud as my approach sounded in the otherwise total silence, nothing answered my intrusion, yet somehow I still knew that I wasn't alone. I couldn't see it, I couldn't hear it, but someone or something was watching. It had been watching my entire journey through its territory, watching with eager intent. It summoned me here, and for a reason. Nobody answered my knock, so I slowly opened the door about the width of my wrist and peered inside. There, at the far end of the nearly empty room, I found a rather disturbing surprise. An old, thin man curled up on a bed near the glass, and I recognized his face. Captain Harris, who no one had seen since we found his office, abandoned all those years ago, had apparently been living here. I'm unsure just how long I stood there staring at him. I had not seen the man since I was a small child. I'd given him up for dead, like everyone else. Yet here he was, alive, and looking like he didn't wish of every inch of his He had wasted away to nearly nothing. Now a little more than a rickety skeleton, thinning skin pocket, liver clot. He had balded significantly. What little hair had skirted that shiny hemisphere had grown long and matted with silk. The only familiar part of him was his uniform, although it had changed just as much. It had grown dirtier than I had ever imagined any garment could, and rendered nearly to shreds. Captain Harrison? I hesitantly called. He started as I did. He had seemed ill, laying with such stillness that I thought he'd taken to his deathbed. The sudden movement was jarring, but I couldn't blame him. It must have been the first word that he had heard spoken, and I really didn't hear. "Who's there?" he croaked, thinning his eyes against the fresh light shining through the gloom. At first I was speechless. I could not bring myself to reply. "Who's there?" Who calls me by that name? He whispered in answer. I knew you. I stammered. My father. He served under you, Fort Wayland. Do you remember? He stood on weak legs and hobbled towards me as quickly as they would carry him. I recoiled a bit when he thrust his face uncomfortably close to my own. He gazed at me with bewilderment. As if through a dense fog. Wayland. You. The young one. He muttered. His foul breath stung my eyes. He paused at length and looked away. No. Another time, another life. I have no name now. I care for them. They need me. He trailed off, meandering off back to his bed of grass. He lay down and faced the wall, dismissing my presence. I raised my voice, shouted, poked, and prodded, but to no avail. It didn't seem that he was ignoring me so much as, in his mind, I simply ceased to exist. I could hear him muttering in his fitful sleep something about elder trees, saplings, and how he wished to join me. Clearly he had gone quite mad, though if he had indeed been tormented by the same entities that led me to him, if he had suffered that bewitching odor and the dancing of the imps for all those years, his state of mind made perfect sense. I could not imagine what he was doing. Begrudgingly, I gave up trying to rouse him. He would answer my questions in the morning. Until then, I was content to rest on the other side of the room. Honestly, I should never have closed my eyes in such dreadful ways, much less while sharing it with a madman. However, I had no strength to brave those woods any further. I doubt the imps would have let me wander far anyway. I had little choice. My sleep was restless that night, even painful. Torrential dreams of howling voices calling. Clouds of dust rose and swirled about me, obscuring my vision. It grew thicker, settling atop my tongue, in my nostrils and ears, and over my eyes. It solidified around me like a crystallizing tomb, and I soon found myself held tightly within that crushing stillness. The weight of ages grew tighter against my body, constricting me until it squeezed the last breath of air from my lungs. I should have died then, but I somehow remained awake and alert enough to sense the minute rumbling, the minute rumbling of something weaving through soil. Roots working their way around my arms and legs and snaring them as my eyes darted in panic behind the closed lids. There was no escape. They wound about my torso. They pierced my chest with surprising sharpness. Through the burning agony, I could feel their narrow ends blanketing and squeezing my heart. The pain grew ever more intense, throbbing through my arteries and veins, just as my limbs fell numb. I heard a faint voice. "Be warned, my lord," it said. "He is young and strong. This one, a man of the forest. He will serve you well." Waking was bittersweet. I gulped deep lungfuls of air in shock, breathing so quickly. Breathing so quickly made my head spin and my heart pound, but I didn't care. Each sweet breath warned me to never take life for granted again, and I wouldn't. I stretched my limbs and flexed my digits, and I sighed as I felt the blood flow through them once more. I thanked God it was only a nightmare. It was a horror I hoped never to experience again. Yet despite my relief, I awoke in terrible discomfort. I had gone to sleep hungry, thirsty, and exhausted, and it had grown far worse in the night. My skin had lost its pallor, and I felt lightheaded. My vision had turned hazy. My mouth felt like a sweltering desert, and I was starving. I had never felt so ill in all my life. Most disturbing of all, a curious rash had spread through my chest, violently red and swollen, and it burned like fire. I originated from the point where the dream roots had pierced my flesh. The agony I suffered that night, whatever had caused it in waking reality, had been real. Had I been in a more stable state of mind, I might have suspected ill intent from the deranged harassment, but I could think only of my parched throat and gnarling hunger pain. I could hardly move, and Harrison was nowhere to be found, so I crawled desperately for the door, slowed by my sudden weakness. But I could not stop. The pangs of hunger were relentless. I would have eaten the dead leaves on the forest floor to eat the pain, if I had to. And I nearly did just that. I was already holding a crumpled mass to my open mouth before I saw something far more appetizing in the distance. I saw Harris, just past the trees in another tiny clearing, tending to a small vegetable garden. Behind him sat a basket of crudely woven tree bark containing what appeared to be large, distorted turnips. They looked edible, and that was the only thing that interested me. I rose and scrambled for the clearing faster than I thought any of my ailments would permit. Desperation is our greatest motivator, it seems. All I could see was food, and my aching body would not stand between me and those peculiar vegetables. I tumbled and clumsily overturned the basket, spilling its contents onto the muddy patch of their growth. Still, I heard no protest from Harrison. If he was even yet aware of my presence, he seemed much too busy dotting over those roots still buried to care. The strange vegetable pulsed in my hands like a feverish heart, and it felt warm, alive in a way no plant should be. But its alien nature did not sway me. I didn't even bother to brush away the mud. I just bit into the filth and released sweet fluid that quenched my burning throat. The husk, rich and succulent, tasted of cooked flesh and the purest goodness of earth. It washed my pain away, made me whole again, and it was to save me for a time. The sudden relief was overwhelming. It calmed my mind and relaxed my body, and I fell into a more peaceful slumber. Though not before catching a blurry glimpse of Harris gazing down at me. He wore a satisfied grin. I awoke in the cabin with the last light of dusk spilling through the half-open door. I'd been out for most of the day, and Harrison had apparently carried me. How he managed to even budge me with his waning muscles, I'll never know. In hindsight, it might not have been him at all, but some other unseen hand. He sat across from me, watching me as he bit into one of those roots that had saved my life. He wore that same grin all the while, munching the life-giving vegetable with yellowing teeth, some broken or missing. He stared into my eyes at length, and he chuckled through a mouthful of strange terms. "What's so funny?" I asked, finally able to speak. He chuckled again, and he stared at the rash on my exposed chest. It had turned leathery, thick, like a nasty scar. I touched it, and I could swear that it moved beneath my fingertips, however. I recoiled in horror, and his chuckle turned into a full-belly laugh, juice dribbling down his chin. I was confused and infuriated. "What in the bloody hell is this?" I demanded. "What's happening to me? What have you done to me?" A seed, he murmured. I narrowed my eyes and was satisfied with his answer. He continued, speaking louder this time. "I planted a seed, planted it there." Pointing to the leathery scar with one bony finger, I clutched my chest with a looming sense of dread. "He's done to me. Oh, done to me, old man!" I demanded once more, moving to strike him, but I froze as he stood. He gave no reply, only removed the thin garment covering his torso, unveiling horror I shudder to remember even now. Especially in knowing that one day my fate would become the same. His body, withered as it had become, was covered in the same leathery scars. They wrapped about his distended belly and over his ribs like a menacing talon, much darker than my own, swollen and visibly undulating with parasitic life. Some scars had darkened like bark, some with small, fleshy branches, and some posted slats of softer skin, not unlike leaves, riddled with inflamed, bursting veins, reddened with his light. You see? He laughed in madness. This is the gift I give you. Like a bear, my gorge rose and I nearly vomited, but he shouted at me furiously, "No, you mustn't waste the feeding root. They gave it to you. You will be grateful." I swallowed hard. A cold sweat glazed my skin as I beheld his grotesque form. What are you? I stammered. A menacing smile crept across his lips. I am the Sended Boy. Evolved. I eat of the root every day that they might grow. I tend to my masters and their needs to keep them safe and hardy. I give them my flesh and food. I will become one with the elder trees. This is my reward. I gasped a series of deep, panicked breaths. You call this a reward? I tried to calm myself and gather my thoughts. What is this place? What are they? Why did they bring me here? They need you. Need me for what? Why me? They will tell you. You will hear them say. I grew tired of his cryptic nonsense. Well, I want no part of it. I just want to go home. Don't you see? The gestures to our surroundings, the forest clearing and this is your home. Your new home. You've been chosen. I wouldn't hear another word. I gathered all of my strength and ran for the door. I threw it open in a rage and sprinted blindly into the woods. You know where to run, Harrison called after me. And they'll not let you leave. I ignored his warning. Nothing would keep me there, not if I could help it. Nettles and twigs stung my bare feet with every step. Bare bushes left me covered in cuts and scrapes. I had no idea where I was going, but I didn't care. I only wished to push as much distance between me and that horrible place as possible. I would not be their prisoner. I ran through the night, even through total darkness. It wasn't until I tripped for the third time and sprained my ankle that I finally stopped. I fully expected the imps or something more terrifying to pounce on me and drag me back to the clearing. They didn't. They didn't need to. And I soon learned. As I stubbornly crawled ever farther into the forest, just as Harrison said, the voices finally caught up to me. Or perhaps it would be inaccurate to call them voices. They used no words, only expressed the force of their will. With demanding aches in my head. They needn't have spoken, for I understood them all the same. They were the trees, the oldest and wisest of them, the elders. They called for my return, and their fury stirred the scar upon my chest. I could feel it rising, much stronger than before, and it made a noise, a dominion of wine. I could feel it tightening around my heart in anger. I rolled about in agony, clutching my chest and begging it to stop. It wanted me to eat again, to feed it, and its hunger was ravenous. Just when I thought that it would kill me, it loosened its grip and allowed me to move, but the voices never ceased. I had no idea what I could do. I desperately brushed my hands through the leaves and dirt in the dark. Surely there had to be something that I could eat, something to quiet the stirring of the parasite. At last, I found a small scattering of berries that might have been poisonous, but I took my chances. I filled my mouth to capacity as fast as I could, and my jaw ached as I chewed and swallowed too quickly. I sighed with relief. Certainly I quelled the hunger of the seed in my chest, however, only moments after I swallowed the juices and pulp came spewing forth from my throat and onto the dry leaves. The berries hadn't even reached my stomach before they were rejected, and the voices in my head sounded once more. The roots, they hissed. The parasite gave one more punishing, breath-stealing squeeze. The parasite would accept only the roots that sated it before, and that's when I understood. The thing in my chest, the seed, was no gift at all. It was a leash. I had never seen that strange vegetable before my time in the clearing, and I suspected I would find it nowhere else. Doubtless, they grew only at the feet of the elder tree. I would have died that night had I not stumbled upon a small stream. The first I'd ever come across since I left my home months before. Perhaps I thought it was the water source that fed the root patch, and I could safely assume that my captors agreed as the pain in my chest and the voices in my head began to subside as I followed it to the south. I followed its winding trail until morning, and it led me faithfully to the path, where I gorged myself on my only available relief. Through mouthfuls and short breaths, I looked around in sorrow at my prison. The seed was within me now, and I could survive nowhere else. Of course, Harrison knew this all too well, so it was no surprise to find him waiting for me.
You cannot leave, boy,
He gravely declared as he trudged towards me through the mud.
Your old life is over. You serve us now.
I could give no reply. I knew he was right. And I despaired. Just as I finished off the route, the voices called again, louder this time, and Harrison heard them too. The largest of the trees groaned, and they seemed to lean inward toward him, almost as if bowing in respect.
It's time,
He declared,
at last. Oh, I've waited for this day. Thank you, my lord.
I watched great roots rose from the soil and wrapped about his legs, climbing his body and piercing between his ribs. His pain was obvious, yet he laughed through the blood pooling in his mouth, giving thanks until his last breath. Before long, he fell still and silent. His glassy eyes focused on mine as the last of the roots sealed him into a wood cocoon and dragged him beneath the soil. It was the strangest, most frightening thing I had ever witnessed. Soon he was gone forever, and I was left alone to contemplate my fate. That night, as I rested on the newly blanket bed of grass, I heard from him one last time, speaking with a wordless voice of will. Same as the elder trees, these were his parting words.
Serve us. Care for us, as I cared for them before you. Here you have all you will need. Serve us well, and in death, live forever among us.
That was 25 years ago. I have lived here alone ever since. I keep the elders healthy, I tend the saplings and the feeding roots, and I save the seeds in my chest to live. I am the tree keeper, just as many before me. And one day, some unwitting child will take my place. Over time, the trees will take back the forest. It will take the dwellings of man. And we can only hope they will spare us, if only to serve them. Until then, I will give them my flesh and labor, and to feed the seed that will preserve my soul in ancient wood.
Dr. Sandy Reeve, now deceased, was a clinical psychologist with over 30 years of experience working with patients suffering from extreme psychological disorders. She was renowned and respected in her field. After retirement, Dr. Reeve published a series of best-selling books detailing some of her most interesting case studies. What you are about to hear is a chapter from her book, The Mad, Mad Mind, My Most Dangerous Patients, that was left on the cutting room floor. I was given the manuscript by a former intern at the publishing company. The story relayed to me was that Sandy was insistent on printing the chapter exactly as you'll hear it tonight, but after a lengthy back and forth was eventually dissuaded by her publisher. It was believed by those in the company that if published, this anecdote, the case of Stephen Haim, may have hurt her credibility in the medical world, which could have in turn affected book sales.
I have been working at Sequoia State Mental Health Center, a psychiatric hospital located in Northern California, for 3 years when Stephen Haim was admitted under my care. He's a shy man with a soft voice and a gentle disposition. An avid reader, Stephen would spend much of his free time, of which there was plenty at Sequoia, losing himself in any book he could get his hands on, especially science fiction novels. Stephen was a ward of the state. When I first met him, he was struggling with mild depression and a crippling drug addiction, but one thing he was most certainly not struggling with was his sanity. Aside from his dependence on illegal narcotics, the young man was as lucid and rational as any nurse, guard, or doctor in the facility. So why had he been committed to Sequoia? For a mandatory 6 years, no less, a hospital that housed criminals so mentally unstable that they had been deemed unfit for general lockup at state penitentiaries? Well, one might assume it was to get his drug habit under control, but the answer is far more complicated than that. In the fall of 1989, Stephen murdered his older sister, Janice Haim, while under the influence of a dissociative hallucinogenic drug known as PCP. By the time he came down from his high, a full day had passed and he was locked inside a holding cell at the county jail. His new surroundings had come as a huge shock to his now sober mind, but even more troubling for Stephen were the circumstances involving his incarceration. He maintained to have had no recollection of the entire event and was horrified when he heard that he had murdered Janice's only remaining family member in cold blood. Stephen's claim of memory loss was not a new precedent. I've seen many well-documented instances of people suffering blackouts while abusing powerful hallucinogenic drugs. And after a series of long, rigorous police interrogations, hypnotherapy sessions, and multiple injections of sodium amytal, it was determined that Stephen was, in fact, telling the truth. He was not lying about memory lapse, nor was his memory somehow being repressed by a guilty subconscious. Stephen was dealing with full-blown amnesia and had completely forgotten everything that had happened. It was determined that he had lost complete control of his faculties while under the influence of the drug and was therefore not fully responsible for Janice's death. Similarly, people suffering from temporal lobe seizures have at times been known to perform extreme acts of violence without even realizing it. In these instances, they are not considered culpable, but are still handled by the state and sometimes committed to mental health facilities for the benefit of their own well-being. To make matters trickier, Janice was killed in such a gruesome manner that the psychologist overseeing the case advised the court not to inform Stephen of the horrific details unless he insisted on disputing the accusations leveled against him. He did not, which was probably for the best since the evidence was overwhelming anyway. His hearing was held in camera. This was up for two reasons. Firstly, to protect Stephen, already grieving the loss of a loved one, from learning the macabre truth about his sister's final moments, and secondly, to prevent the press from catching wind of the event and sparking up a media circus around a man who's already suffered a great deal. The entire matter was taken care of swiftly, and Stephen was sent to Sequoia, where I would work with him for the next 6 years. In that time, I would get to know him quite well. As the primary psychologist treating him at the hospital, I was privy to all the details of Janice Haim's murder, but I made sure never to bring them up with Stephen, who was elected to remain ignorant to the grisly specifics involving his sister's death. My main focus was to help him battle his addiction and aid him in overcoming the guilt he felt for killing her. My strategy was a success. Within a few months, Stephen had put the drugs behind him, and by the spring of 1990, he seemed to make peace with his dubious past. Still, I couldn't help but feel sorry for Stephen. One of the few patients at the center not dealing with a debilitating mental illness, yet forced to mingle and interact with schizophrenics, manic depressives, and people suffering from dissociative identity disorder. In my opinion, he was ready to leave the facility after a year because his stay at the hospital was court mandated. He was forced to wait out the entirety of his sentence. To his credit, he had accepted the hand he was dealt, often telling me during our one-on-one sessions that he was just thankful the judge's ruling hadn't been more severe. Nevertheless, once his mandatory time at the clinic was up, I was happy to proclaim to the board overseeing his release that Stephen was of sound mind and ready to reintegrate into society. He was released on November 14, 1995. Still a relatively young man with his whole life ahead of him. I remember feeling a strong sense of accomplishment as he walked out the door. One stronger than I'd felt with any of the other patients I'd treated at that hospital. Often, my job is to teach people under my care how to manage their illnesses without becoming a danger to themselves and others. Stephen, on the other hand, was cured. His drug habit long gone, and his self-loathing no longer an issue. I felt confident that he would turn his life around and not slip back into that drug habit that had flipped his entire world upside down. 2 years later, after his probation lifted, I heard he moved up north and rented a house in a sleepy little town out of state. In the summer of '99, I received a letter that Stephen had sent to my office requesting a telephone consultation. He needed advice about some recent problems he'd been experiencing and had written a phone number at the bottom of the page where I could reach him. If it were anyone else, I probably would have simply written them back with a recommendation for a clinician in their area that could help them. It goes against my code of ethics, you see, to give professional advice to patients no longer under my care, but I felt a sort of irrational sense of guilt after watching Stephen spend so many unnecessary years locked away at Sequoia. So against my better judgment, I picked up the phone and dialed his number. I was a bit disturbed when I heard how nervous and panicky Stephen sounded when he picked up the line. Right away I began to wonder if he was using again. I asked him if that was the case, and he assured me he was not. He had even deliberately chosen an employer that drug tested so he wouldn't be tempted to revert back to his old ways. It was a relief to hear, but his reason for writing me was disconcerting.